Well, thank you for having me. I'm walking around with this headset on. I'm not going to be anywhere near as dynamic as Steve Jobs. I didn't wear a turtleneck. I don't have any impactful advice in any pragmatic sense. I always say the people that I study and are interested in are dead. This is one of the things that makes history a very attractive thing to take a look at. You can all rest assured that I'm not going to give any patriotic speeches or pompous declarations tonight. I just wanted to give an overview of what was going on in 1774. I know a lot of you are working and doing some volunteer work for the Historical Society and transcribing some of the documents from the local town meetings. So I thought I'd bookend the presentation with a couple of things from the town meetings that you're taking a look at. I'm going to talk about it and then give some context to some of the things that you've been reading about, which you're probably already familiar with, but I'll do a deep dive and try to show that there's some international implications to the things that you're reading. And also I'm going to approach 1774 in a similar way. The historian Mary Beth Morton just recently wrote a whole book on the year 1774, making the argument that this is kind of the decisive year. This is when the American Revolution was effected. She defines it as a long year, and that goes back into late 1773 with the Tea Act, the destruction of the tea. They didn't call it the Boston Tea Party until the 19th century, and then reaches forward into early 1775, right as the war is actually breaking out. So I'm just going to begin by showing this. I have a lot of long primary source documents, and I don't know if the Historical Society can make those available, but you can read them at your leisure. I took these directly from the town meetings that you're all looking at, and I started with the Hinsdale town meeting in March of 1774, and I'll end up with the Keene town meeting in early 1775 to show how the towns are different and how people traveled in terms of their thinking. As many of you may already know, Hinsdale was a very loyalist town. And if you take a look at, and this is where I took the title of the talk, they begin by saying, you know, having seen a lot of patriotic speeches and pompous declamations in the newspapers that are constantly lecturing us about the rights and privileges under the British Constitution, that everybody's, and you'll see these in the town meetings, everyone's making resolutions about British liberty and the British Constitution, and they have these resolutions, and they're kind of mocking it. The people in Hinsdale are kind of sarcastic about this. And it basically says, they have several resolutions, is that people should not get involved in political issues that they don't fully understand, to make a lot of pompous declamations. And also, people should have a right to have different opinions. And they should be able to go around and express those opinions and go about their business without fear of being tarred or feathered, which was something that was a very real danger for people who disagreed with some of the resistance movement. The other thing that they mentioned, which you might have noticed, there's a lot of discussion about the tea, the destruction of the tea and the Tea Act and the implications of it. They say that it's the opinion of this town that all this stuff about the East India Company sending their tea here for sale is not because of the tyranny of an act of parliament for the purpose of raising revenue, but it's basically the private interests of a bunch of merchants who are making a lot of money by smuggling tea, people like John Hancock. This is a very loyalist perspective on what's going on. A bunch of self-interested rich people are deluding people into resisting the landing of the company's tea. And basically, if we spend half the time listening to a bunch of boring patriotic speeches that they're hearing in the newspapers and spent more time engaged in our business, we'd be a much better society. You'll notice that they mentioned that the newspapers were constantly full of this. For those of you who've looked at 18th century newspapers, 18th century newspapers were pretty cosmopolitan. They had international news all over them. In the early 18th century, in terms of political essays, newspapers tried to be somewhat balanced and let people with different political perspectives make their cases in anonymous essays. But by the time we get to the period of the crisis, and I won't go through the Stamp Act, which many of you are familiar with, the British attempts to raise revenue, I'll just allude to the big principles. By the time we get to the 1760s, increasingly newspapers are becoming polemical. This is not a recent development. Here's a shock. People were politically divided in America for a long time. And the newspapers become actively pro-resistance, anti-resistance, loyalist. The most popular newspaper in New Hampshire, the New Hampshire Gazette, tilted resistance, revolutionary. There were a lot of highly respected loyalist published newspapers, the Boston Chronicle, Rivington's Gazette. In this period, loyalist editors were publishing a lot of essays criticizing the resistance position. In Boston in particular, some of those editors were physically attacked. And this was a period in 1774. If you actually look at the newspapers, there's a very fierce debate about the nature of the British Constitution of government itself. Here you can see in the New Hampshire Gazette at the end of the year that this is one of those, from the Hinsdale perspective, one of these patriotic speeches and Pompous Declamations that they're endorsing what the Continental Congress has already suggested that the colonies adopt as measures, namely the Articles of Association, to boycott British goods. So obviously there's been a long struggle over the question of raising revenue in the colonies, and most of you already know what those issues were. I'll just highlight the fact that it was not a matter of people not wanting to pay taxes. That's kind of a misunderstanding of what was going on. The question was, what is the constitution of government itself? Where is power located? Who is able to do these things? Who is equal and who is subordinate? And basically the bottom line argument over that was people in the colonies kind of saw themselves increasingly as equal British subjects. And this is what historians now would call the result of settler colonialism, where you're looking to recreate elements of the society that you've come from. And they were beginning to imagine themselves as equal Britons, which constitutionally, one of the cornerstones of the British Constitution, is that only a body that's directly representative of the people is able to raise revenue. So when Parliament tried to raise revenue within the colonies, first in an internal tax, it raised these questions. We're not represented in Parliament. The only place that we're represented in is in our colonial assemblies. We're willing to pay taxes, but only through them. That's the resistance movement take on that. Loyalists see it a little bit differently, is that the national government governs for the greater good of everybody, and that the colonial assemblies are not effectively increasingly equal with Parliament itself. So there's a number of attempts, I won't bore you with all of them, to raise revenue after the end of the 7 Years' War, which was a global war in which North America in particular was seen to have benefited from. And so Parliament attempted to raise specific taxes that it had not tried to do before outside the Great Britain itself and the entire British Empire, including the Caribbean and in North America. They had a lot of failed attempts. The Stamp Act, which was an internal tax. Everybody said, well, this is a tax on internal things. Parliament tried some external taxes where they did some customs on things that were imported directly under the auspices of the British government that you have to pay customs on. In 1767, they passed a whole litany of external customs taxes on things that could only be imported directly from merchants in Great Britain, like glass and lead and tea. By 1770, Parliament, facing resistance to that, abandoned all of those taxes except for one. And everybody pretty much accepted that by 1770, was on tea. And as some of you, Professor Duggan's here from the management department, you know about the British East India Company. Some of you may know that this tea was coming from one single corporate source. And they had a monopoly on the legal trade. There was plenty of illegal trade. So what Parliament did in 1773 that everybody reacted to was that they authorized the company, and I'll explain why they did this, they authorized the company to sell their tea from China directly in the colonies without a need to export it first to Britain, pay a custom in Britain, and then have the merchants re-export it. Basically, the bottom line was this tax already was in place. It made tea cheaper. So Parliament is thinking this is a good way to effectively raise revenue. This tax is in place, we'll make tea cheaper, people will buy more of it, it will be competitive with illegally smuggled tea. So here's the broader context of this. What's going on globally is that the British East India Company is one of the most powerful corporations, multinational corporations in the world at this time. It's a centerpiece of the British economy. They were a colonizing force in and of themselves, and we see elements of the Second British Empire and the British East India Company that's premised not so much on settler colonialism. Settler colonialism is when people try to recreate the traditions of their mother country, and also remove or exterminate indigenous people. So that's settler colonialism. What the British East India Company was doing in South Asia was engaging in a kind of exploitation colonialism, where they exploited the indigenous population. The company was so powerful, it had its own army, its own navy. It was colonizing Bengal directly, and they were levying very heavy taxes on their Bengal subjects. And they were using those profits to buy tea in China to re-export to the advantage of the company. So the company was so important to the British economy that the customs duties that the British East India Company pays amounted to 1/3 of all of the British government's collected customs at this time. So this is a major source of revenue for the British government. Their profits are expanding in the mid-1760s as they're colonizing Bengal. And the British government, facing their debt, they begin to consider, maybe we should regulate and tax this company. And the company becomes very nervous about that. They don't like this idea at all. In fact, they don't want to be directly taxed. And a lot of Americans take a look at that and they say, oh, this company has a kind of parallel charter from the king, but it's very different. It's exploiting the indigenous population of South Asia. The way that the company gets out of it is they call it kind of tribute. It's basically a bribe. So every year the company pays £400,000 to Parliament so that they don't bother them, they don't tax them, and they don't regulate them. And here's a map of the expansion of the British East India Company's colonies in Asia, in South Asia. In this period, that map over here, around 1760 is the most accurate, for you can see where Bengal is. And so this is a source of the revenue that provides the company the ability to buy the tea in China and provide it to the entire British Empire legally. Here's the problem on the eve of 1773 when the Tea Act was passed. The company had catastrophe. In Bengal, 1769 to 1770, there was a major drought, which was totally exacerbated by the company's exploitative policies, their violence, their extraction of revenue from the region. And the drought quickly led, under these circumstances, under the auspices of the company, into a famine. And then disease began to spread. A lot of reports were coming out of Bengal that millions of people were dying. And historians estimate that in this brief period, about 1.5 million people in this region died from this drought. So this was an absolute catastrophe. As that goes on, revenue declines. Their ability to make their purchases and meet their debts continues to decline. The company's stock plummets. And this is a very dangerous moment in the company's existence. It looks like it's in serious trouble. In fact, they fall so deeply into debt, they can't afford to pay their bribe to Parliament. And a lot of people in Parliament are beginning to think, well, maybe we should regulate and tax the company directly, but they come up with a compromise. This is in 1773 during the Tea Act. The compromise is to give the company a £1.5 million loan to continue and to put out the Tea Act to help raise their revenue so that the company doesn't collapse. This is viewed as government intervention in a corporation. It's the language of the financial crisis of 16 years ago. The company was just simply too big to fail. North American resistance to it, I've already talked about their concept of raising revenue. Of course, everyone thinks that this is a reasonable accommodation, that this is a way that the company can be bailed out and that revenue can be raised in the empire, and that people in the Caribbean and North America will enjoy cheaper legal tea. They do not. The resistance movement, loyalists, as you can see in Hinsdale, they have different feelings about this, but the resistance movement makes the argument that this is a backhanded way of bribing us into giving up our rights to self-government, that this is a kind of conspiracy to take away the liberties of free British subjects. And they take a look at this empire in Asia and see this brutal exploitation of indigenous people, and they say, well, we understand that, but it's almost as if the British government is beginning to do that to us, that they're beginning to exploit us when we see ourselves as on an equal kind of standing. So this is why people in North America resisted the landing of the tea. There are a lot of good strategies used by other governors, which is not to land the tea, to just pay the customs themselves and move the ships along. But as many of you know, in Boston Harbor, the loyalist governor of Massachusetts insisted that the company's tea be landed and that the customs be collected. The tea is destroyed, and this event is known as the destruction of the tea in December of 1773. And that leads to some pretty draconian consequences in Parliament. That this is a financial threat to the well-being of the entire empire from the perspective of members of Parliament. They respond with a series, even they call these laws the coercive acts. And I'll let you take a look. I won't read through all the coercive acts. You're probably distantly familiar with many of these. The one that unifies the most North Americans into the resistance movement is the Boston Port Act, because that seems to have a very economically damaging effect on people who were not really wrapped up in the debate over constitutional power. They felt like if I can't export my corn and my wheat into an Atlantic market, that's going to damage me. And there's a lot of resistance to many of these. The Massachusetts Government Act, you've probably heard of that before. So this was the illustration for the talk that I sent in when people took a look at it and probably thought, what the hell is this? This was a very popular cartoon at the time. Basically, and it's, as you can tell, it's a North American resistance version of what's going on with the coercive acts. In fact, the resistance movement renames them. They call them the intolerable acts, and they articulate what's absolutely intolerable about it. And this is not a very subtle metaphor for what's going on, but we'll try to unpack it. And you can see the broken teapot at the bottom of the steps. In the center of the image is a woman representing America, and she's on fire. So this is how the crisis is viewed. Here you see prominent, fairly wealthy colonists trying to put the fire out and save America. And those people are all kind of not clearly understood who they are. And then there's this person over here with a monocle holding the Boston Port Bill, which is viewed as the most odious of all the acts. He's the only person standing on the ground. I don't know if people know this, those of you who are Revolution buffs. I know I'm not really a Revolution buff, but some of you may know who this is. It's the one figure you might be able to recognize. It's Frederick Lord North. It's the first minister of the government, which is not surprisingly, it's the head of the ministry. There are some other, and so he's just standing by watching America burn, holding the Boston Port Bill. You'll notice, not so subtle metaphor, up in the sky are some other people. And I don't know if you recognize who some of them are. They're actually members of royal government that I'll try to unpack a little bit. You'll also notice in the subtlety department, they've got Satan up there in the clouds with them. So whoever these people are particularly bad. They're even worse than the prime minister or the first minister. They're using bellows to burn America. So these must be particularly bad people. You'll notice that one of the bellows is marked Massachusetts Bay. That's the Massachusetts Government Act. That's to show that that's adding fuel to the fire. And then you'll notice that one of them is the Quebec Bill, which I didn't mention. The Quebec Act is passed in June of 1774. This is right before Parliament adjourns. It was not meant to be one of the coercive acts, but it was understood as one of the intolerable acts. And there is a lot of baggage behind this. Some of you may already be familiar with the Quebec Act, and it seems from a British imperial perspective, Parliament thinks, well, this is going to be pretty innocuous. This is designed to better govern the newly conquered, at this point 11 years long, occupation of the province of Quebec. The one thing it does is it ensures religious freedom for Roman Catholics who remained in Canada after 1763, that they would be free to practice Roman Catholicism. Many of you probably know New England in particular was particularly vehemently anti-Catholic in this period. It also reinstated French civil law, taking away British common law, which was consistent with the French colonial past. It was easier that way to administer the colony. No representative assembly. Those are all the minor things. The big thing that I want to draw your attention to really quickly is that it extends the territory of Quebec to the area east of the Mississippi River and north of the Ohio River. So this is what Quebec looks like after the Quebec Act. And this is why this is on there. For settler colonists who are looking to expand territorially and remove Indigenous people, this suggests that they're being blocked, at least by the colony of Quebec. It has a longer history, which I'll be as brief as I can with this. There is a lot behind the Quebec Act. It's a symbol. It's becoming a symbol of territorial expansion at the expense of Indigenous people. Here's the context of it. In the 7 Years' War, the French and Indian War as it's known, which I will not rehash here, many of you are very, very familiar with that. This was a long war in which different Indigenous peoples had different interests as well as different empires. The Haudenosaunee had a claim to this region, but the people who lived in this region, who were a very mixed group of people, they lived in this region. There were Miamis, Shawnees who had lived there for centuries. There were also Anishinaabe peoples of the Great Lakes. There were some refugee peoples who were removed from further east. The Lenape people of the Delaware Valley had been removed to the Ohio River Valley. And for Indigenous people, the 7 Years' War was a war for independence. Alert. The seven Years' War doesn't turn out the way that you learned in school, where the British Empire wins this decisive victory. It's far more convoluted than that. In fact, a lot of people think that they won. Almost everybody thinks that they've won, except the French Empire. The Haudenosaunee think that they've won. But most importantly, the native peoples of the Ohio River Valley believe that they've won because they've negotiated a separate peace with the British Empire, the Treaty of Easton of 1758. In which the British Empire negotiated with 13 independent Indigenous groups of people, including the people who lived in the Ohio River Valley, and recognized their sovereignty and pledged not to colonize west of the Appalachian Mountains. So from an Indigenous perspective, this was a successful war for independence, and a lot of people in the British North American colonies were not very happy about that outcome. In fact, when the war ended and the Treaty of Paris was signed, the British Empire decided to disregard the terms of the Treaty of Easton. And basically, North American colonists came into the region. The commander-in-chief of the British Army, Sir Geoffrey Amherst, refused to engage in further diplomacy with Indigenous people. He shut down all diplomacy, which created one of the most vast pan-Indigenous coalitions in the history of the Atlantic world. This is not well known. Some people have heard of it before. This is Pontiac's War, which in many ways is the most significant war for Indigenous independence in the 18th century. It's a vast coalition of Iroquoian, Algonquian, Anishinaabe-speaking peoples who come together to assert their independence and sovereignty against the British Empire. And I won't go into the outcome of the whole war. Those of you who've heard about the story of smallpox-infested blankets, this is the war that actually comes from. The British commander-in-chief does give the order to spread blankets that were infested with smallpox. Indigenous people negotiate what they believe is their sovereignty as they end this war, and it takes years for it to fully end. While the war is going on, Parliament, which is already bothered enough by all the debt, the national debt is doubled in 1763. This is something you may all remember from grade school. The Proclamation of 1763, which is not innocuous. This is lying behind all of this anger, lingering anger over the Quebec Act. There's the line. Parliament is so fed up with the inept governing of North America and the actions of North Americans themselves that they passed this edict, which is not meant to be permanent, but it's a temporary edict that there will be no British colonization west of the Appalachian Mountains except without royal permission. By the way, as I always tell my undergraduates in my American Revolution class, and Pat, you probably heard this story in my Franklin class, there's 26 American colonies in 1775. Everybody, oh, there were only 13. Well, there were 13 that rebelled. So it then becomes a larger question of, why did they split? And I have some very specific answers for the Caribbean that I won't get into tonight, but what I'm trying to suggest here, if you see this map visually represented, the 13 rebellious colonies are all bound by the Proclamation of 1763. So imperial expansion into indigenous lands is a major issue and cause of the American Revolution. This is the revised map after the Quebec Act. This is how the British Empire sees the world. I'm not saying this is how indigenous people saw the world. This is how they saw it. And this was a world in which the empire was controlling all of these different factions that it had sovereignty over. So they're expanding the borders of Quebec, which indigenous people who live in this region, they don't recognize the sovereignty of Quebec. They just completely ignore that. But this is viewed as an indigenous reserve. And this is kind of the growing British view of the empire in the world. It's kind of shaped by the experience of the East India Company. And this is a very famous Copley portrait of Sir Guy Johnson. And he's posing in his red regimentals, but he's also wearing indigenous breeches. And in the background is the Mohawk leader Thayendanegea. And you'll notice is in the shadows, in the dark. And this is kind of an allegory for how the British Empire sees itself in the world, where indigenous people are subjects. They're not equals, they're subjects. And they're subordinated to British power because the British Empire envisioned expanding into this region on their terms. This is kind of a hierarchical view of empire. A lot of colonists are beginning to wonder, what kind of world is it where the people that we've been removing from their lands, who we see as an obstacle to our success, are being protected by the imperial government and considered as subjects. So this increases the anger towards the British Empire. So all that is lurking behind the Quebec Act. And again, I'll go back to that cartoon. The Quebec Act represents this. This is something that's unspoken, that the patriotic speeches and pompous declamations are not talking about, but everybody recognizes this is a shorthand for territorial expansion at the expense of indigenous people when they see the Quebec Act that way. The other thing that's lurking behind all this, and I'll be super quick with it, Tim, you knew I would talk about this, the Somerset case in 1772. This is the talk of the entire British Empire and the Atlantic world in the 1770s. And the decision comes down the year before the Tea Act. This is an abolitionist, popular white abolitionist image of slavery being a moral evil in 1772. I will point out that the most successful abolitionists were African Atlantic abolitionists, and they had a very different approach than the white abolitionists. Whereas white abolitionists always just focused on enslavement as a moral evil, African abolitionists talked about how racism and enslavement were twin moral evils. Olaudah Equiano was spending some time in England at this point. He would later in the 1780s write his famous autobiography. And he was in contact with the free black community in London and was involved in some of these discussions about legal defenses. Actually, 1774 was the year that Ottobah Cogliano arrived in London as an enslaved person. He later frees himself and writes, even compared to Equiano, a far more radical vision of the evils of the British Empire in terms of race. So lurking behind all of this is a kind of Afro-Atlantic abolitionism that's extremely radical. People might recognize this person, who's one of the white abolitionists of this time, Granville Sharp. Granville Sharp had the money and resources to bankroll some of the lawyers that were basically brought into play. This was a strategy that Sharp used, but Afro-abolitionists used it as well. And I'll be as quick as I can. The context with this is that enslavement was legal in every single British American colony. But there was no law of enslavement on the books in Great Britain itself. Enslavement had vanished. So the laws of enslavement in the British Empire were all written in America. So the question is, what is the status of an enslaved person in Britain? Because there were thousands of them, as I have in one of my notes. There were literally thousands of enslaved people. The reality was they were enslaved, but only by the virtue of colonial law. And the question was, what happens if we were to test this in the courts? What if it went all the way to the King's Bench and raised the question, is this consistent with the law of England? And there were many attempts. Many of them were dismissed. This is the one that comes before the King's Bench. I'll be super quick with it. This is the background to that. It focuses on James Somerset, who was enslaved by Charles Stewart of Virginia, and he was born in Africa. And he ends up in London. While he's in London, 1771, he runs away. And he's clearly harbored by the free black community in London, who begins to plan a defense for him. And they get in contact with Sharp, who had been engaged in a lot of these other cases, to see if he would finance the attorneys. The free black community directly petitioned the Chief Justice of the King's Bench, Lord Mansfield, for a writ of habeas corpus, because he was captured. Somerset was captured by his enslavers, people he hired, and his punishment was he was sold to a ship captain to be re-enslaved in Jamaica, which was a death sentence at this point. So the demand for the writ of habeas corpus brought it to the attention of the courts. Mansfield ordered there must be a writ of habeas corpus, and it made its way to the courts. Finally, it came before the King's Bench in 1772. And we don't know, and Tim, you know this well, we don't know exactly what Mansfield's decision was because it wasn't written down, it was transcribed, it was delivered orally, as were cases at the time. This is one of the most commonly used ones by historians. I won't make you read the whole thing, but his bottom line decision, and I want to go back to this image, that's him. He is an arch conservative Tory Scot. He is super conservative. Everybody expected him to uphold the law of enslavement. And he does, but it's a very subtle decision. The bottom line of his decision was this, in this case of just one person, James Somerset. That was all he was hearing. It was a question of what's the status of Somerset. It wasn't a general statement of anything, and that was what it was designed to be. It was supposed to be like property law in the eyes of Mansfield. He ruled that enslavement is such an odious institution that it can only exist by positive law. And since there is no positive law of enslavement in England, Somerset must be freed. Now, everybody made what they wanted to out of this. For the enslaved community, it clearly opened the door to the end of enslavement, certainly in England, which it didn't for many more decades. That's the thinking. Or maybe within the empire itself. And the empire was horrified. People in the Caribbean immediately took a look at this, where there are African majorities in one of the most violent genocidal regimes in the British Empire. And the first thing that they said is, we don't want Parliament to protect our liberties, we want Parliament to pass a slave law so that this is all solved right here and now. That was what they asked for. In North America, rumors abounded that the British Empire would use enslaved people to enforce their unconstitutional laws, that they would be proxies of the British Empire. And there are all kinds of rumors about what was happening. By the way, the enslaved community, everybody knew about this. The nickname for James Somerset was Uncle Somerset in North America. People talked about him all the time. So all of this is lurking behind that. Now, I do have to tell you, I don't mean this to make the British Empire sound humanitarian in any sense, because it was absolutely not. It was one of the most brutal regimes in the history of the world. And Mansfield was a conservative, pro-empire person. The fundamental question for him was, what trumps what? The law of Virginia or Parliament? And in the end, he's going to choose Parliament every single time. Because for him, it was not a question about the future of the institution of enslavement. For him, it was a question of power and where it was located in the empire. The response to this is people hear about it, and in places like Virginia and parts of South Carolina, and we know this, there are insurrections. Enslaved people start rising up. And of course, this is prevalent throughout the entire Atlantic world. There's a long tradition of African revolutionary activity, and this is a continuation of that. And this is linked to the recreation of African polities and structures in the Americas. So a lot of people take measures into their own hands and take revolutionary actions. Elsewhere, people take other approaches. The first anti-slavery committee in American history is the Committee of the Slaves that was formed in 1773 in Boston. And it was created mostly by African-born people. And it was an anti-slavery committee modeled in part after African traditions, but also to mimic the committees of correspondence that existed at the time. And one of the things that the Committee of the Slaves did is they issued a petition. This is known as Felix's petition. There were many signatories to it. And it's a petition to the Loyalist governor, Thomas Hutchinson, and the Massachusetts Assembly. They're hedging their bets either way, whoever listens. Here's why enslavement needs to end. They made their case. And it's steeped in the language of Protestant evangelicism, which is not surprising at the time. I won't make you read the whole thing. By the way, in 1779, a little New Hampshire history here, enslaved people in Portsmouth do the same thing. And this is Nero Brewster's petition. It was signed by 19 other people in Portsmouth, New Hampshire. They were all born in Africa. Nero Brewster is attributed as the main author. He's one of many authors. And if you do a little digging behind this, Nero Brewster was basically the African monarch in the tradition of African Election Day of Portsmouth. And the other signatories were members of the court. They were all African born. This is a group of people who have kind of reconstructed in Portsmouth a small African revolutionary committee, and they passed a very similar petition calling for an end to enslavement in New Hampshire. This is during the war. Heroically, the New Hampshire Assembly says, let's table it. It's too touchy. And they just let it languish. Let me return to this. What's going on here? Everybody received this. And while there's the patriotic speeches and the pompous declamations, everybody understood what a lot of this visual imagery meant. It was meant to evoke an emotional response in the audience. And so here you see, once again, the first minister with the Boston Port Bill, and you see these people in the air with the devil, with the other bills, the Quebec bill, which everything that carries in terms of territorial expansion. This is a Scot, maybe a member of the ministry, but also quite possibly another Scot, the royal governor of Virginia, Lord Dunmore. In fact, it looks just like him, who a group of enslaved people in 1774 immediately approached and said, you know what, if something happens, free us, we'll take up arms. This is all kind of deeply coded. Now that we can take a look at, do you see the person in the middle fanning the flames? That is Lord Mansfield. So None of these pompous declamations are talking directly about these issues of territorial expansion, indigenous rights, and enslavement, but it's all represented in this image. In response to that, and I'll try to wrap this up, all the colonies illegally, because it's not illegal, but it wasn't an actual legislative body, they created an action group, which they called the Continental Congress, which met in September of 1774. 12 colonies were represented. As you know, because you're reading about this, Congress passes the Articles of Association, which they recommend that everybody embrace, which is a vow not to purchase or buy British goods until the coercive acts are lifted. And of course, Congress is not a legislative body. This is not a law. This is people just coming up with, hey, you need to do this. And you need to appoint some committees to inspect it. And oh, by the way, as you're all reading, and if you're taking a look at some of those town meeting notes, let's identify the people that refuse to sign. And then we'll publicize their names so that everybody knows. So in terms of it being a kind of democratic decision, it's a group of people that are kind of taking action and forcing some of these actions through these informal political bodies. The committees are actually very effective, and the committees get the signings done. To bring this back to New Hampshire, New Hampshire was fairly quiet by the standards of some of the other colonies, especially Massachusetts Bay. Part of this had to do with the Wentworths. Those of you who know colonial history, you can't throw a rock in 18th century colonial New Hampshire without hitting a powerful member of the Wentworth family. They basically, I think a British official asked, is there anybody in the government in New Hampshire who's not named Wentworth? But the Wentworth family was very powerful, but they were very effective because they had a very moderate position on a lot of these things. John Wentworth opposed the Stamp Act. He argued against it quietly in Britain, but he said that we have to obey the law. He nominally enforced the law, like the White Pine Act. The Pine Act, which was no white pine over 100 feet tall, was supposed to be taken by anybody but the king. But he did a lot of winking at people and the Wentworth family always did this, that you can take some of these down informally. He was also the Surveyor General of His Majesty's Woods, which made him responsible. And actually in the 1770s, Parliament put some pressure on him. Hey, you know what? You should enforce the law a little bit more. He was very skilled at speaking to a lot of different constituencies, and he would reach out to the western counties. That's why this area of New Hampshire is like a who's who of 18th century British imperialism, like Dartmouth, it's named after the Earl of Dartmouth, Hanover, the House of Hanover. He was very effective. However, even he was losing control because the resistance movement did spread. More and more people were convinced that this was the right way to approach it. And a lot of this had to do with the economic dislocation of the Boston Port Bill. And New Hampshire had its share of disorder. There were the Pine Tree Riots, 1772 was an attack on the Hillsborough County Sheriff. The people who did it were never brought to justice. This is when Wentworth was trying to enforce some of that law. I'll jump ahead a little bit. You've probably seen the Appeal to Heaven flag before, which is kind of back in the news now. This was meant to be a flag of revolutionary resistance against a tyrannical government. By 1774, it's pretty clear that Wentworth is losing control, and his response to this is kind of similar to what other governors do. The assembly is difficult to control. The assembly is passing laws that he doesn't agree with, so he just sends them home. And during that period, when the legislature is not in session, in December of 1774, rumors are flying all around that the British have actually bombarded Boston. There's all kinds of rumors flying around. There's rumors that the British are sending troops to confiscate arms and that perhaps they'll be arming other people, including not just the British Army, but others to crush any kind of resistance. And there's 2 days of attacks on Fort William and Henry. We were talking about this, which is going to be commemorated pretty soon. That's upcoming. It's interesting what counts as war breaking out and what doesn't. I know in my home province of Pennsylvania in 1765, a bunch of vigilantes were attacking a British fort in the Trans-Allegheny West. And that turned into a shooting war, but that wasn't viewed as the beginning of the American Revolution. Essentially, groups of people in a mob, as the Loyalists represented them, and many of them were respectable people in the community and members of the militia, stormed the fort. They did it in 2 separate days. On one of the cases, John Sullivan, New Hampshire's delegate, one of our delegates to the Continental Congress, was present, and they confiscated some of the cannons, and they took down the Union Jack. So this is kind of a revolutionary act, that the government has become kind of so tyrannical to our cause, to American rights, to American liberty, and American equality, that they're trying to reduce us to subordinate status and exploit us in the same way that the people of Bengal, the same way that Indigenous people are being exploited. They take down the British flag. So, people were so upset by all of these activities together. This has such an effect on people in terms of thinking the British Empire, and that's why they use terms like they're trying to enslave us. And this is a metaphor that's very, very troubling, because a lot of Loyalist writers, as I can show you, will try to point out that there's a lot of hypocrisy in calling for liberty and enslaving people. But for a lot of people, it wasn't really hypocrisy. It wasn't a contradiction. It was saying, we know what enslavement is very well. It exists, we use it, but what you're trying to do to us is enslave us. Now, Keene, actually, in contrast to Hinsdale and Charlestown and some of the more Loyalist towns, Keene was always a pretty pro-resistance town. And it's not surprising that by the time we get to early January of 1775, as most of the towns in the Monadnock region did, they voted to embrace the recommendations of the Continental Congress, signed the petitions, signed the oaths of association and publicized people, and also they created their committees of inspection. And here you can see the people that were being appointed. And I used the transcriptions that were used by the Historical Society General. Were you working on that one? Or was that, yeah? Now, I'll jump ahead just one and just come back to the previous one. In pretty short order, the Wentworths lose control of the whole province. They dissolve the assembly, and people in the towns basically select members of a provincial congress. They create a rival government. And that rival government actually governs. That's a truly revolutionary body. And even though it's extra legal, it's a functioning government. In August of 1775, Governor Wentworth and most of his direct supporters, they left on a British warship, and the colony was in flux. It's not really well known that effectively New Hampshire was the first state to functionally become independent. Shouldn't be a shock to those of you who are from New Hampshire, because the question is, there's no government here because the governor is left, what do we do? And so this provincial congress says, let's write a constitution that effectively creates a kind of sovereign republic. So that happens as we get into early 1776. What's going on in 1774 is a battle for the hearts and minds of the American people. As you can see in the beginning, a lot of people were on different sides of this, and this is a fierce battle that's waged in the newspapers. And there's a lot of essays back and forth about what's the future of America. And there's a lot of emotional imagery that's being used. But there's a new image that's beginning to coalesce starting in 1775, and in 1776 it becomes kind of the national basis of unity. There's this image of fear that kind of unites people. And the new image that is coalescing in the newspapers is a fear that the British government, and again, this is a critique of the British government, is so tyrannical that it will use Indigenous people to crush resistance and the revolution, that they will use them as proxies. Now, Indigenous people did not see themselves that way. They were sovereign, independent people, but this was the image that was emerging in some of the pro-revolutionary newspapers. And you can see it in 1774, the New Hampshire Gazette is talking about plots of Canadians, which is French people who are probably Catholic, uniting with Indigenous people to enforce the coercive acts or crush any kind of resistance. You can see in 1768, a loyalist is actually pointing out the hypocrisy of this language of talking about enslaving people in the British Empire. And increasingly, that other image that's emerging is that the British Empire will cynically use enslaved people as proxies to crush the revolution, which is terrifying to a lot of people. I'll go back to that picture one more time and then I will end. In November of 1775, after many petitions from African American enslaved people, Lord Dunmore, the royal governor of Virginia, does pass a proclamation that offers freedom to enslaved people in exchange for military service. Now that comes much later, but there was a lot of focus on Dunmore's activities before. Once you see that, you can see in this image, even though this seems to be a weird, bizarre image, for people who lived at the time, because the past is a foreign country, these are all symbols and metaphors that people visually, you didn't have to read the essays to understand what it really meant. So that's my context for 1774. Thanks for coming out, and I'd be happy to answer any questions that people have.
Thank you so much. So at the moment, we don't have any questions online. Do we have any questions from anyone here in the room? Oh, here we go.
I'm interested in the level of communication that took place between the residents of the various colonies.
Yeah.
Within New Hampshire.
Yep.
And between New Hampshire and other parts.
Yeah, the committees of correspondence, that's exactly what they were designed to do, was to communicate and coordinate resistance between, and typically the Continental Congress was called the Continental Congress to indicate that this was not individual colonies doing this, that this was continent-wide resistance. So it was very well communicated, and even within provinces, the towns would communicate with each other. In Massachusetts, having a town meeting under the Massachusetts Government Act was illegal unless you needed to raise revenue or conduct specific business. But people would use that opportunity to communicate with each other and create solidarity.
Would you say what was happening here in the progression that was happening on this side of the state matches what was going on in other regions of the state?
I would say it matches it very closely, because there's a few loyalist strongholds, and you can see that in various areas of the province and at different times. I think it tends to be a little bit more pro-resistance than the eastern part of the province, because that was still dominated by a lot of wealthy merchants who had connections. By the way, wealthy merchants split on both sides. People who were involved in legal trade tended to conveniently be overwhelmingly loyalist, whereas people who had interest in the smuggling trade. But in New Hampshire, the Wentworths had their fingers in everything. So I would say, if anything, the Monadnock region, slightly more pro-resistance. Hinsdale's kind of unique. Yeah.
Do you have any sense of why Keene, Claremont, did you say? Or
Yeah.
Claremont and Hinsdale were more loyalist than our Keene?
Yeah, I mean, I have a couple of hunches. The Anglican Church was stronger in both areas, and the Anglican Church was often correlated with a lot of loyalist sentiment. I think Charlestown today is one of the few places that I know, after the Revolution, for good reason, the Anglican Church in the United States became the Episcopal Church because the head of the church is the monarch. Charlestown still has an Anglican church. And I think it also has to do as well with people who wanted tea. There are some essays that came out where people, like the Susanna Spindle essay, that comes out that a lot of people just give me the tea. In fact, some loyalists were, actually Bree Batchelor, who I'm interested in, who's from Nelson, he actually made a trip to Quebec during the boycotts, and he got some company tea, and he was selling it like a drug dealer. Like he was being pursued by the local committees, and he would just, you know, drop the tea in a bush and try to run away. So yeah, I think in Hinsdale, there's like, just leave us alone. We want to go about our business and drink tea.
Nothing to do with the river necessarily. They're both a little more on the river than Keene is. I don't know if that has to do with, you know, merchants and.
I would say that they're kind of like the rest of this region though too, because as you know, Jenna knows really well too, this region has all kinds of ties to the West as well. Though the Wentworths really worked on knitting the West with the eastern part of the province. So it's kind of a distinctive region that we share a lot of commonalities with Vermont. I think it's just typical that one of the things that everybody forgets about the American Revolution, I get irritated when some historians talk about the American Civil War as the Second American Revolution, only because if that's true, the American Revolution is the first American Civil War, because British Americans fought each other brutally. And actually New Hampshire doesn't have some of the horrible violence that happens in other places like New Jersey, New York, South Carolina.
I don't remember, some years ago, there was like a historical fiction about Governor Wentworth and running off to Canada.
Yeah. He was governor of Nova Scotia, and he maintained his Surveyor of His Majesty's Woods title. From Portsmouth? No, he went out on a Royal Navy vessel. I think that was fictionalized. Oh, if it were true, I would love that.
Well, you were right, Greg, that I did think the part about the British East India Company was pretty fascinating. I think it's just fascinating that the news of the famine caused by the British East India Company traveled all the way to Boston in such times, and that the Boston, or the people in New England identified with the people of India as being potentially as exploited as they were. That's just really fascinating. So I just appreciate you bringing that up. And actually, it was on my list of something I wanted to think about this semester, and I never quite got to that to-do list. So that was great. Thank you so much.
Yeah, and I mean, actually, the plight of people in Bengal was much discussed in Great Britain itself. It wasn't just limited. It was a discussion in the empire. And I think what disturbed a lot of North Americans was that the company was exploiting. They didn't have the terms exploitation colonialism and settler colonialism like scholars employ now, but I think they're thinking about it in those kinds of terms, is that the company's practicing exploitation colonialism. And for North Americans, it raises questions, is that coming for us? And that troubles them. Yeah, I would love to, in fact, well, since you asked the question, then I get to talk about the Caribbean. And I have an absolute explanation for why the Caribbean was the most valuable part of British America. Without question, Jamaica was economically far and away the engine that was running the British Empire and modern Britain. And those colonies did not rebel at all. They did protest the Stamp Act, and then they kind of dropped everything. The other thing that they experienced was, and I talked about African Atlantic revolutions, they experienced it all the time. And I didn't have time to talk about it, but in 1761, there's an Aakan-speaking revolution in Jamaica known as Tacky's Revolt. The British call it Tacky's Revolt. And it looks like it's close to being a successful revolution. It was almost like Jamaica was Haiti before the Haitian Revolution. And in the midst of the 7 Years' War, the British Empire committed regular troops, Royal Navy to crush that. And everybody in North America knew about Tacky's Revolt. And it was an African majority in Jamaica. In fact, they had to use African Maroons on the side of the British Empire to crush the rebellion. The short story is, in the Caribbean, they were completely dependent on British centralized power. When there were African revolutions in North America, it was the local militia that dealt with it. But in the Caribbean, with African majorities, they were dependent on the British regular army. So they weren't going around saying that the British army is this instrument of tyranny. They were terrified of it being withdrawn. That's why when the Somerset decision came out, nobody was disputing the right of Parliament to legislate. They just wanted to beg them, please legislate on this so that we can be safe. So when the war broke out, for them to cast in with the resistance, the British Empire would have done the same thing that they did in North America, is that they would have used African allies to probably crush the rebellion there. Everybody was afraid of that. That's why you don't see the Caribbean acting the same way.
The Maroons were escaped slaves, were they?
Yes. Yeah, they were.
I always felt that they kind of disappeared into the shadows, but then they were somehow recruited to fight on behalf of the empire?
Well, in Jamaica, there were Maroon communities. They were basically free African independent republics all over the Atlantic world, which were refugee runaway communities. In Jamaica itself, there were sizable Maroon republics. I call them African republics that are independent, and they're in the interior. You're absolutely right. They're in inaccessible regions, and at first, that's how they create viable societies. But over time, Jamaican authorities negotiate with them and recognize their independence. So actually, for those people who already have their independence recognized, there's a lot of people, African-American historians who don't know some of the background to that, will say, well, why did they fight against these African revolutionaries? Well, they already had attained a kind of independent African republic, and for them, it was politically expedient to do that. Actually, in the British colony of Sierra Leone in the 1790s, when Nova Scotian Black loyalists rebel against the company's policy, they bring in Jamaican Maroons again to crush that rebellion. So the goal of most African Atlantic revolutionaries in the early modern period is to create viable independent republics. And for people who have done that, they're gonna stay committed to that. In some cases, it's quite exclusive. Like in parts of the Caribbean, like in St. John's, there's a revolution by exclusively Akwamu people they expect to keep the sugar plantations open and enslave other Africans because they're trying to recreate the Akwamu kingdom in St. John's. And that's why a lot of other Africans fight against them. So there's African currents under that.
Do we have any other questions in the room? I haven't seen any pop up online, so I'll do it. So I want to do a last call for any questions. All right, well, if we're all set, I'd like to thank Dr. Knouff for coming through tonight and giving this talk. And I'd like to thank you all for everyone who came here, both in person and online, to this program. Thank you very much.
Thanks for having me. I need to do this back.